Holy words long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart.
To those who are still here left standing, good morning to every one of you. It feels like a plague has just kind of swept through over the last few weeks. And this is a good time, I think, to make a public service announcement. Whenever you have a quarter of the congregation that's down for whatever reason, get your flu shot, take your vitamins, I think, wash your hands. It's always good to do those types of things. Otherwise, next week, if we have another quarter of our people that are gone for whatever reason, we may just kind of diminish it down into nothing. But we do have quite a few of our people that are out. We have a few people that are sick this morning with a bunch of different things, kind of all over the spectrum. So a lot of people to keep in your prayers, a lot of people to be thinking about, especially this week as we go about our daily life. Several years ago, I was fortunate enough with our high school band for my senior year of high school to go to New York City. And it's not my favorite place in the world, but it was at that point the only time I've ever been there. And I loved the time that I was there. I loved seeing Times Square, I loved seeing Broadway, I loved all the different things. But there was one moment in that entire trip, those 4 or 5 days that we were up there, that really, to this day, has kind of stuck out with me. And that's that we were just getting done taking a tour, I think, of the NBC studios. We were sitting on the sidewalk, and I looked up, and we were talking with a couple of friends. I looked up, and I saw down the street, I saw what I thought was Dan Aykroyd. I saw a man that was walking down the street. This would be where that would pop up. There it is. I saw what I thought was Dan Aykroyd walking down the street. And so I looked at him for probably a few seconds, and it kind of that creeper stare where you just kind of look at him because you're not sure if that's him, you're not sure if it's just a blur. And I did what I promised myself that I would never do at that point in time. I screamed and I jumped, and I think I pointed a couple times, and then reality set back in, and I maintained my composure. I got a picture of him as he walked right by. I can't find that picture. But there's something about seeing celebrities, and there's something about seeing people like that out in the wild that just makes you excited. I know he probably wasn't nearly as excited to see me as I was him, but there's something about celebrity sightings, there's something about seeing people like that out in the wild that are just fascinating. And I think in a small way, that's what you see a little bit when you talk about the ministry of Jesus. For instance, if you look at Matthew the 9th chapter, starting in verse 1, if you look at Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 1, I think you see a little bit of what I'm talking about here. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 1, there's a little bit of a backstory, and then there's a couple of verses that relay a story that I think exemplifies this pretty well. Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 1. Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 1. First verse kind of gives some background. I'm going to leave that picture of Dan Aykroyd up there for the foreseeable future, by the way. But in Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 1, it says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. And this is not atypical Jesus ministry. This is something you see in every one of the Gospels. Every time he preaches, every time he teaches, you see a lot of people that are following. He would attract large crowds because of his teaching, but also because of his miracles. And so in Matthew chapter 8, verse 1, it says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. But what's most peculiar about this is what happens in the next 2 verses. A leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. What's remarkable about this story, this is something we've mentioned, I think, several times from this pulpit, is not the fact that the leper touched out to him. It's the fact that Jesus reached back towards him. If you know anything about leprosy, especially not only the physical effects, but also the religious implications of that moment, you know that it speaks volumes. But what's most amazing to me, at least in context of what we're talking about this morning, is in Matthew chapter 8, verse 1, you have large crowds following you. You can think about dozens, hundreds, possibly even thousands of people that are following him. And out of all those people, a leper comes and talks to him. And Jesus takes the time to not only talk to him, but to reach out towards him. And if there's one hallmark of Jesus' evangelism or his door-to-door ministry, if you can do it, I think that's the one that kind of typifies it. Because Jesus wasn't, as so many teachers that day was, this kind of standoffish person that stood up in his ivory tower and just kind of talked down to people. He was somebody who was with the people day in and day out. You see it with this leper. You also see in Mark the 5th chapter with a woman. Mark the 5th chapter, this will be what we focus on this morning. In Mark the 5th chapter, starting in verse 25, you'll also see another story that is parallel, or is very similar to this type of story. In Mark chapter 5, 5, starting in verse 25, it says a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years. And there's a lot in that verse. Imagine that type of affliction for 12 years. And had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but had rather grown worse. What a horrible situation. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought to herself, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, and this is the most interesting section, at least to me, he asks, who touched my garments? And apparently the apostles are also completely befuddled as to why he would say this, because in verse 31, the disciples then say to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you. Once again, the hallmark, people are flocking to him. And you ask, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. A lot of times when you read the story of Jesus' healing of people, when you talk about him healing people of leprosy, when you see him rising from the dead, it's very action-packed. It's very action-oriented. You have this happening, you have Jesus saying this, and then you have the event taking place, and then that's the story. And there's a whole lot of those types of stories, and I don't mean to demean any of those stories in Scripture, but this one stands unique to me. Not only because of the situation that this woman is in, but the emotion that Jesus felt back to her. And I think when you look at it, especially from the woman's perspective, she sacrificed a lot to get to this point in time, namely, first and foremost, utter disappointment. Because what you have in verses 25 through 29 is kind of a few verses of backstory about the situation that this woman was in. This is a woman who had suffered a bleeding for 12 years. And in a time period where life expectancy, depending on social class, can vary anywhere from 35 to 75 if you're lucky. 12 years is a huge chunk of your time. And not only that, but she was somebody who, as it mentions there in verses 25 and 26, who had gone to all these different doctors, who had spent every penny that she had. And not only was her situation not better, but it actually became worse. If you can imagine having a situation that is painful, that is embarrassing, that is distressing, and you spend every waking moment for a decade trying to get better, and it doesn't get better, it actually gets worse, you're at some point going to be disillusioned about that ailment. And think to yourself, I'm not ever going to get better. I'm going to be discouraged, I'm going to be downtrodden, I'm going to be completely depressed, because this is just my station in life. And I think it says a lot about this woman that at this point in time, when she hears about Jesus, she drops everything and runs up to him, knowing that there are a lot of those types of people. There's lots of people that claim to be able to heal somebody. There's lots of people that come through selling snake oil. This will make you better. I can heal you. And there have been lots of people that have gone to quote-unquote faith healers in today's world looking for exactly what this woman looked for. The difference was she found it. Because Jesus is the Son of God. But she not only risked disappointment, she also risked, I would say, embarrassment. Because who is this person with the bleeding? Who is this person to come up to the very seat of God himself? To walk right up to the Messiah, the Savior of the world, the one who has at this point in the book of Mark done miracles that have established his identity. Who is this woman? To show up and to touch the cloak of Jesus, the Son of God. Not only this, but you see in the very next chapter, Mark chapter 7, actually 2 chapters later, Mark the 7th chapter. You see a somewhat embarrassing exchange, I think also a great showing of faith, but a relatively embarrassing exchange for the victim here. Mark the 7th chapter. Starting in verse 24, it says, Jesus got up and went away from the region of Tyre, and when he had entered a house, he wanted to know no one of it, yet he could not escape notice. That happens all the time with Jesus. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, and there's kind of the broad description. Specifically, she was of the Syrophoenician race. She kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But listen to Jesus' response in verse 27. He was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. You hear what he calls her in that moment. He calls her a dog. Not only refuses to heal her, but also calls her dog. And this isn't Jesus just being condemnatory. It's not him just being rude. Her faith is seen in the very next few verses. Verse 28, she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed from the children's crumbs. And he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. She risked enormous embarrassment, being a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, to approach the feet of Jesus and ask for his healing power. And this hemorrhaging woman experienced the same thing. Jesus could have very easily looked at her and said, you are ritually, spiritually unclean. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And the entire crowd of people that are watching there could have erupted in laughter. Could have said, how dare you? How dare you show up to Jesus and ask for something He's not going to associate with you because primarily you are ritually unclean. And that's really, I think, the thing that she risked the most. If you look at Leviticus, the 5th chapter. Leviticus 15, rather. In Leviticus 15, there's a whole lot of Old Testament teachings that talk about this woman's presumed status at this point in time. And in Leviticus chapter 15, starting in verse 19. Leviticus chapter 15, starting in verse 19. All has to do with ritual and purification laws. In Leviticus chapter 15, starting in verse 19, it says, when a woman has a discharge, if her discharge is in her body as her blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Keep in mind where Mark 5 is happening, in a crowd of people. Verse 20, everything also in which she lies during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything in which she sits will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water until evening, whether it be on the bed, verse 23, on the thing where she is sitting. When he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. There's a whole lot of impurity happening in Mark the 5th chapter. And this woman showing up in a large crowd of people not only should never have been there in the first place, but put everybody there at risk of impurity as well. Now you're thinking to yourself it's a completely different situation, it very well may be, but look at verse 25 because the laws comply there as well. If a woman has a discharge of her blood in many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge she shall be as if it was in her menstrual impurity. She is unclean. Verse 26 down to verse 31 further exemplify this fact. No matter which way you slice it, when you look at Mark the 5th chapter, this woman should not have been there. It was against her law for herself. It was against the Old Testament law for her to even be there in the first place. And Jesus could have very easily looked at her and said, you need to be gone right now. She chose not to. And what you see in Jesus in the time period, the same type of ritual uncleanness I think happens with leprosy that we read from earlier. But when Jesus looked at her, he felt enormous compassion for her. Enormous love for this woman, for the situation that she was in. And he helped her. You see this all the time. If you look, for instance, in Matthew the 9th chapter. If you look at Matthew chapter 9, the very same story happens. The reason we're going to Matthew 9 and reading the same story. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 20, it's a parallel account of this woman that's bleeding. But in Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 20, it says, a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up from behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. She was then saying to herself, if only I touch his garment, I will get well. Jesus, verse 22, turned and saw her and said, daughter, take courage. Notice that use of the word daughter. Daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well. At once the woman has made well. Notice the direction that's happening here. People are flocking to Jesus. People are coming to Jesus in droves by the hundreds, possibly by the thousands. And this woman reaches out towards Jesus and grabs hold of his cloak. And not only does Jesus not react by that, he actually feels a strong sense of compassion. When you look down a few verses in verse 27, almost the exact same thing happens except in reverse. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out, have mercy on us, Son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men came up to him. Jesus said to them, I think this is interesting, he said, do you believe that I am able to do this? They said to him, yes, Lord. And then, verse 29, he touched their eyes, saying, it shall be done to you according to your faith. If you look at Matthew chapter 9 and verse 20 down to verse 27 together, what you see happening in this instance is a model of compassion, it's a model of teaching, it's a model of evangelism, of interaction that far surpasses the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees who couldn't stand to be seen in the same room with them, that's why they lambasted Jesus for talking with the Pharisees and eating dinner with the tax collectors. And this exchange in Matthew chapter 9, you see people reaching out to Jesus and holding him. You see Jesus reaching back and taking care of them. And not only that, but 17 out of the 45 so-on miracles that happen in the Gospels, there's some degree of touching that's going on. Jesus never wanted to be a Messiah that was distant from the people. He never wanted to be the Savior that kept people at arm's length, that talked down to them, that spoke above their level, and that looked at them as lower than he was. Philippians chapter 2, verse 1 through 8 establish that fact very clearly when it says that he divested himself of all his glory, came down to earth and took the form of a bondservant. Not just a bondservant, but even to death on the cross. Jesus wants to be among you. He wants to be among me. He wants to be among His creation, healing them tenderly, loving them. As He did on so many occasions. And it's for that reason why when you look at Hebrews, the 4th chapter, when you look at Hebrews, the 4th chapter, and all these theological and doctrinal disparities, and the Old Testament being usurped by the New Testament, the Old Testament being fulfilled through the New Testament. I misspoke of that. That the Hebrew writer, whoever he may be, although I believe very strongly that it's Apollos, and if you disagree with me, you can just go ahead and get out. But the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 4 goes through great pains to establish the fact that Jesus was one of you. He interacted with us. Hebrews chapter 4, starting verse 14, it says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." That's not an unemphatic phrase, ladies and gentlemen. Hold fast, grab it, close to your chest. Verse 15, "We don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with our weaknesses. The one who is tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." Jesus didn't have leprosy that I know about. Jesus didn't have a bleeding for 12 years, but He intimately associated with people that did. Verse 16, "Therefore let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." As if to just drive this point home further, in Hebrews the 10th chapter, starting in verse 19, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19, the Hebrew writer, once again Apollos, really hammers this point home. Verse 19, by saying, "Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence into the holy place by Jesus, by a new and living way which He inaugurated for us through the veil that is His flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water." Verse 23, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who has promised is faithful. And let us then consider how to stimulate one another to love and to good deeds." The point that the Hebrew writer is making there in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 10, after chapter 4 and chapter 10 is, you need to draw near to God. I need to draw near to God. And the way in which we draw near to God is not through apprehension and fear and this kind of I am not worthy sense, although He is Jehovah. It's a sense of intimacy, it's a sense of companionship. The Hebrew writer in chapter 2 would talk about how He is not ashamed to be called our brethren. And we need to start regarding Jesus as our brother, as our Savior, as our Messiah, as all those things that exalt His godliness and His deity. But also as somebody who knows what it's like to go through what we're going through this life. By faith, I can reach out towards Him. By faith, I can look towards Him. By faith, I can touch His cloak. And yet the reason we don't sometimes is because we have sin in our lives. It's because we feel like we're unworthy, because in some ways that we are. In Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2, Isaiah writes there, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it can't save, nor is His pen so dull," I'm missing that word, "so dull that it cannot reach you. But our sins have separated us from God." God is not far away from any of us. If we will humbly bow the knee and reach towards Him. Reach towards Him in faith, hoping to just grab His cloak, hoping to just be closer to Him. We see that faith every day in our life. But we also see, especially from Mark the 5th chapter, is that faith needs to be personalized. I fear sometimes when we talk about faith, we talk about it in big grand measures. We talk about it in terms of big scope things. We talk about faith to move mountains. We talk about faith as a mustard seed, something that's smart, starts off small, but then grows up into something huge. And we talk about faith to build an ark. We talk about faith to sacrifice our firstborn. We talk about faith in big, huge themes. And we hardly ever talk about faith in terms of personalization, what it means to me. And yet in Mark the 5th chapter, this woman's faith was not something that she was able to walk on the water. It wasn't something that she was able to feed the loaves or feed 5,000 people. It wasn't faith in big things. It was faith simply to get well from the one single malady that she wanted. For a decade, the only thing she wanted was to be rid of this. She got it. Because it mattered to her. And right now there are things that you go to every day in your prayers, whether it's for a month, whether it's for a year, whether it's for a decade, whether it's for a half a century. There are things that keep revisiting into your life that you pray for over and over and over and over again. That's what I mean when I say faith needs to be personalized. Faith needs to mean something for you. I find it interesting that when Jesus turns around and He says to this woman after she grabs the cloak, and He turns around and He says, "Who touched me?" People have argued about why Jesus said that. And the very, very wrong people have said, well, Jesus asked who touched Him because He didn't really know who touched Him. I don't think that's the point at all. I don't think Jesus turns around and is just oblivious to the fact that He can heal somebody, but He doesn't know who touched His cloak. That's not what He's getting at. I believe that the reason Jesus turned around and asked who touched him was not for his benefit, but for her benefits. Because you see at this point her coming forward, confessing everything. It almost sounds like, according to the text, that she grabbed his cloak, was healed, and then disappeared back into the crowd. And yet when he says, who touched me, that's when she comes forward and confesses everything, trembling at his feet. It's not for his benefit, it was for her. Faith was very personalized in that instance. It wasn't about healing the world. It wasn't about walking on water. It wasn't even really about salvation. It was just about something that she needed desperately and something that she earnestly desired. I want you to do something with me. I want you to go to Isaiah chapter 53. All of us read Isaiah 53 probably fairly often. We've either read it 1,000 times, or we should have read it 1,000 times, or are at least somewhat familiar with it. And so when you read Isaiah 53, starting in verse 4, we talk about it in very universal terms. I want you to read this with me. If you're not there, go there, because I want you to read this to yourself. Isaiah 53, starting in verse 4, he says, surely our griefs he himself bore. You know this section. It's the suffering servant passage, Isaiah 53. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us have sheep like gone astray. Each of us has turned his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Ladies and gentlemen, those are beautiful words. I love all three of those verses. And as you read Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6, you can't help but kind of be overwhelmed with the amount of sacrifice that God made for us. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to look back at Isaiah chapter 53, and I want you to, every single time it says us, we, any type of plural word, I want you to substitute I or my. Isaiah chapter 53, starting in verse 4. Read this again with me. Surely my griefs he himself bore, and my sorrows he carried. Yet I ourself, however that for us, I myself esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for my transgressions. He was crushed for my iniquities. The chastening for my well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging I am healed. All of me, I like sheep, have gone astray. I have turned aside to my own way, and the Lord has caused the iniquity of me to fall on him. You notice how Isaiah 53 changes a little bit when you start making it more personal. You notice how when you look at Isaiah chapter 53 and you stop talking about it in universal terms and you start describing it as something that's very personalized, how the entire picture changes. The thing about it changes. Because Jesus' death on the cross is no longer about the sins of the world, although it is about that, but it's also about my sins, as heinous as it can be. Faith needs to become personalized. And when Jesus turns around and says, and all three synoptic gospels record this, when Jesus turns around and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. What a powerful phrase. The fact that he calls her daughter. The same way that Ephesians talks about how we go to him and say, Abba, Father. The way that we look to him as our Father. Faith absolutely needs to be personalized, but it also needs to be executed. We don't have time right now to get into the whole faith and works discussion, which is not a discussion or a controversy really in my mind. When you harmonize James and Romans, there's no discussion there. I think they're harmonized very well. But regardless of which way you slice it, when you think about faith, it needs to be acted on. Or else there's no faith really that's there to begin with. Let me tell you this. The woman that had the bleeding in Mark the 5th chapter was not the only person that day that had anything wrong with her. It's not as if everybody else that was there, Mark the 5th chapter, all the crowds that were there, were just kind of there because they just were tagging along. There were people that probably had other maladies. There were people that probably had broken bones. People probably had suffered from migraines. There were people within those hundreds or thousands of people that had issues that were wrong with them. I'm almost sure of it. But this woman who had the hemorrhage, the woman who had the bleeding for 12 years, stepped forward and said, notice the faith, if I can only touch his cloak, I shall be made clean. That's the executable faith that I'm talking about. The undeniable faith that God can do what he says he will do. The fact that God cares about you, the fact that God cares about me. As Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 says, those who believe in him must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Look at Mark the 9th chapter. Go a couple chapters later. If you're still in Mark 5, look at Mark chapter 9. Look at Mark chapter 9, starting verse 22. Mark chapter 9, starting verse 22. There's a starting in verse 20, rather. Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 20. It says, they brought the boy to him, and when he saw him, Jesus, that's the him there in that passage, immediately the Spirit threw him, that's the boy that's afflicted with the demon, into a convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And he asked his father, verse 21, how long has this been happening to him? And he said to him, from childhood, and has often thrown him into the fire and into the water to destroy us. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Notice verse 23 there, or verse 22 there. If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Notice Jesus' reaction in verse 23. Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. We look at Mark the 9th chapter, and we look at this individual, we can't imagine that somebody has the gall to walk up to Jesus and say to him, if you can do anything. That phrase should never come out of his mouth. If you can do anything, help this person. And Jesus is just as incredulous as we are, because he looks back at him and says, if I can do anything, if you have faith, anything is possible. And I love the man's very simple and humble response there in verse 24 when he says back to him, I do believe, help my unbelief. What a powerful and a relatable passage that is. Because when we look at this person, we say to him, I can't believe that God, or that somebody will walk up to God and say, if you can do anything, and yet don't we do that exact same thing in our prayers? Every single time we go to God in prayer, and maybe not every single time, that maybe is an embellishment, but oftentimes when we go to God in prayer, we look at him and we say, if you can do anything, or if it is okay, or if you don't mind, or something along those lines. And we either doubt, number one, God's power subconsciously, or we doubt his willingness to. And verse 24 speaks volumes about all of our faith when he says, I do believe, help my unbelief. That's the honest, humble, contrite spirit that we should all have when we look towards God. I do believe. Help my unbelief. I struggle with it every single day. I struggle with my lack of faith. I know that God is all-powerful. I know up here that he can do anything. I know that he can heal any malady. I know that he can do whatever he wants to do. But I struggle with that down here. I do believe, Lord. Help my unbelief. Faith has to be put in action. It's when we doubt that God is even capable of something that we begin to lapse in prayer. That we begin to have lackluster prayers towards God because we don't really think that either he can or that he would do it. Faith has to be executed. And I love this woman's encouragement, her drive to just simply touch his clothes, because ultimately that faith was rewarded. In Mark the 4th chapter, I want you to look back at this. Mark the first chapter, rather. Notice the surety in her voice in Mark the 5th chapter. Look at Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 40. Mark chapter 1, verse 40. Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 40, it says, a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Verse 41, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing to be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Now that's a very short healing story. But there's two things you need to recognize about this passage. In Mark the 1st chapter, verses 40 through 42, this is still very early in Jesus' ministry. Not a lot of things have happened at this point. This is before the feeding of the 5,000. It's before the walking of the water. It's before all those major events happen. And the second one is, the second interesting part, is the fact that this leper looked at Jesus and did not say, if you can, like we read from Mark 9, but said, if you are willing. And I love how verse 41 then picks up on that theme by says, I am willing. Be cleansed. The surety is seen both in Mark the 5th chapter and Mark the 1st chapter when the woman says, if I can just touch his cloak, that's how I'm going to be healed. And this person says, if you are willing, I know that you can make me healed. They believe, ladies and gentlemen, that their faith will be rewarded. And that's why when you look at the very next chapter, Mark the 2nd chapter, starting in verse 14, when it talks about the calling of Levi, Mark chapter 2, verse 14, and he's a son of a tax collector. He's a tax collector rather himself. In verse 15, it says that he was reclining at the table of his house with many other tax collectors, many other sinners, dining with Jesus and his disciples, and there were many of them, and they were all following them. And when the scribes of the Pharisees in Mark chapter 2 saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and with sinners? I can't imagine the Messiah, if he is who he claims he is, fraternizing with those type of people. Verse 17, hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners unto repentance." Make no mistakes about it, ladies and gentlemen. When we describe the Pharisees and Sadducees as faithless people, we're not describing them in terms of they don't have faith in God, that they don't know who He is. They believe in God. They believe in Jehovah. Who they didn't believe was in Jesus. And they didn't believe, more importantly, in their need for Him. That's why He's called there, kind of pulled out of Mark chapter 2, verse 17, is that He's called the great physician. Because the people who recognize their dependency and their need for Jesus are the ones whose faith will be rewarded. And you could look at me and say, well, Ray, there's a lot of faithful people who weren't rewarded physically. That's true. Paul the Apostle struggled with the thorn in his flesh for his entire life. Why wasn't his faith rewarded? I can tell you this. Paul the Apostle is rewarded in heaven. His faith may not have been rewarded physically here with that thorn in the flesh, but you can look more about that in 2 Corinthians if you want to. But his faith was ultimately rewarded with an eternal home above in heaven, which is the greatest blessing, the greatest gift that any of us could ever be given. When you look at Mark the 6th chapter, the same exact thing happens here. Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, Jesus went out from there, came into his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and the many listeners were astonished and saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" They know who this guy is. And they took offense at him, verse 3. Verse 4, Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor in his own hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household." And he could do no miracle there except that he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he wondered at their unbelief. If you want to confuse God, or if you want to make God wonder at you or exclaim at you, marvel at the fact that He can do miracle after miracle after miracle, and you still don't know that He's God. And yet when we look at these people, we look down at them, we say, I can't believe that Jesus was sitting right in front of you, and you didn't recognize Him. We do the exact same thing in 2018. We read all these stories, we read these books cover to cover, we see the feeding of the 5,000, we see the resurrection of the dead from Jesus, and yet we still sometimes think, I don't know if God can heal me. I don't know if God really does have my best interest at heart. I don't know if He really wants me to be happy, and I use that very accommodatively. I don't think God cares about me. And our prayers sometimes reflect that. Ladies and gentlemen, modern medicine has come a long way. And I will tell you, I've seen it more in the last couple of years with just the people in this room than I had ever seen it before in my life. Modern medicine has come a long way. And there have been fantastic things that have happened. But the only person in that day that could have killed this woman was Jesus. In today's world where you have people that are deaf, that can become partially, or can start hearing partially again because of cochlear implants. And people who are born blind, that can have some of their sight restored. You bring Jesus on the scene in Mark the 5th chapter, He doesn't bring them partially back to health. He doesn't bring them partially back to life. It's all or nothing. They can't see, now they can see. They can't hear, now they can hear. They're dead, now they're alive. Do you believe that God can do that? God may not physically heal you of your infirmities, and I'm not here trying to say that He can, but do I doubt the power of God? Well, I look at Him and say, I would pray to Him, but He doesn't really care about it. I'm reaching out, but it's not really in faith. Just kind of in hesitancy. Or do I believe that God looks down on me? In Matthew the 8th chapter, this is what we'll finish with. In Matthew chapter 8, once again, I'm not saying that Jesus will heal you of all your infirmities. I'm not trying to say that, but I want us to ask ourselves about the power of faith. Not Matthew chapter 8, I'm sorry. I'm going to go a little bit and rewind here. Look at Matthew 14, brother. That's what happens when you mix your notes up a little bit. Matthew the 14th chapter. Starting in verse 28. Matthew 14, starting in verse 28, says, Peter said to Him, "Lord, if it is You, command me to come out to You on the water." This is when the disciples are on the water. Jesus walks out towards them. They're worried that they see a ghost. Peter knows who it is, or at least believes that it's who he is. Verse 29, he said to him, "Come." Peter got out of the boat, walked in the water, and came towards Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." Verse 31, immediately Jesus stretched out His hand and took hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" A lot of people have read this, and if we were reading this under any other circumstance, the way that we would encapsulate the teaching in Matthew chapter 14 for our purposes is Peter started to sink when he took his eyes off of Jesus on the waves. And I think that's a great teaching. And people chide Peter here in this instance for saying, well, I can't believe that he has no faith. He's staring right at Jesus. But let me tell you one thing that Peter did right, according to Matthew chapter 14. In verse 30, when he became frightened, he began to sink, there was no doubt in his mind who he cried out to. He looked at Jesus and he said, Lord, save me. Peter is literally beginning to sink in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And the only thing that he can think that can save him is Jesus. And you can chide Peter for all the different things in his life, speaking impulsively, pulling out a sword and trying to defend Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and all those things he probably deserves and then some. But at this point in his life, when he knew that he was sinking, the only thing in his mind was the fact that Jesus could save him. When you're sinking in your life, when you're encountering tough times and trials and tribulations, and it feels like the entire world is closing in on you, who do you go to? Who do you reach out for? Who do you cry for? And if it's anybody besides Jesus, we need to reevaluate our hearts. We need to reevaluate our faith. We can look to the things of this world, and there's nothing wrong with seeking out help in this world, but if we're looking at anything else besides Jesus as the ultimate solution for everything that ails us, we need to reorient our hearts. We need to reorient our faith and look towards Him as the one that can save us. If your faith is weak, ladies and gentlemen, if your faith is off kilter, if you're looking towards everything else, I would encourage you to look back towards Jesus as the author and the finisher of your faith, the Lord of your life. If He's apart from you, you have this opportunity to make Him the Lord of your life. Won't you come as we stand?
Holy words long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart.